Okay. What's that? Okie doke. Listen, I don't want to cut your time, chaps. Thanks ever so much for doing this. It's very nice to see you both. Probably a few more people joining in a second, so we'll let them in as they come along. So, welcome to this Experts at Work, which has got a great title from the gents here: Transforming Workplace Culture, the Role of HR and Shaping the Future of UK Workplace. This session, as you know, is for members of all three of our networks, and as I say, we recorded this session. So, welcome to Adrian Walcott and Martin Roach of Brands with Values. So, drawing on the UK Culture Study of 2024, they'll be sharing some ideas and practical suggestions for addressing cultural health issues. Adrian's a brand marketeer, formerly with Eurostar, Barclays, Unilever, and Nestle, and Ogilvy Advertising, and is also a co-founder of BAME 2020, while Martin's a designer and strategist who formerly ran an ethical branding agency, working with Fair Trade International, the NHS, Goldsmiths, and Bernardo's, amongst others. So send us questions and suggestions via chat throughout. We keep an eye on those. We'll send the slides around later. You got slides, haven't you, chaps? Is that right? Or are you just talking through?
Yeah, we got some slides.
Yeah, cool. Thanks ever so much. And I'll ping a couple of questions for them at the guys later. So I have to tell you that Adrian and Martin have sent me some questions, which it'll be obvious that they've sent me the questions because they're rather better quality than you usually enjoy on these webinars. So I'm simultaneously grateful for their advance notice and quietly resentful of the quality of it. But we'll come to that in time. And for now, if I can pass you over to Adrian first, I think.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Richard. Pleasure to be here. Nice to meet you all. So before we get into the slides, I guess I'll just talk to you about the genesis of why we created them and the way we go about it. And I guess like we speak to a lot of HR people, and I think a lot of them agree with us that everyone understands the link between corporate culture and commercial success. But people will find it challenging to really make culture both tangible and actionable. And what we've seen from the conversations we're in is that you're trying to run change and transformation with data that doesn't allow you to make it tangible and actionable. And you're kind of relying on anecdotal feedback, workshops, hearing things, as well as engagement surveys. And we felt there was a job to be done to really make the data in this space robust so you can make better and smarter decisions when it comes to people change. Because the HR function for me is no longer a tactical one, it's a strategic one at the heart of helping CEOs drive transformation and change. So, with all that in mind, we went on a bit of a journey to try and make culture tangible. And we ended up, based on a lot of research and a lot of algorithms, building a software platform that allows us to decode culture. And we do it for the good and the great, but that's not for today. But what is for today is to show you how we've used this culture decoder tool to do the largest study on the culture of the UK. We did this work in collaboration with PwC, where they used our platform, and we used it across 30 industries, encompassing about 6,500 people, which was kind of nationally rated. And we've just pulled out a snippet of some of the information we have. We have millions of data points, but we've just pulled out some of the key things for the purposes of this discussion. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll just give you an indication of how it happens or what the culture decoder does, of which you're going to see the outputs presented by Martin very shortly. But very quickly, it's very obvious to us what culture is, and we think culture is just a manifestation of how people treat each other, how they communicate and behave. And organizations are just constructs where humans do that. So the only currency that we can see that will really help you decode culture is if you know what drives human behavior, which are linked to value systems. So when we understood that, we found this piece of research by a chap called Shalom Schwartz, which I'll come on to. But we created this system where we simply asked three questions to decode culture, all of which is going to come apart very soon. But we just asked people, what are their personal values? So we have that data now on what gets the UK out of bed in the morning. We then want to understand what does the UK see in their workplace? And the final thing we want to know is what do people want to see in the UK workplace? And the way we get the data that you'll see is just by people answering those questions by hitting 10 words on walls of up to 100. And there's an example here. But as you'll see in the next slide, while people are just hitting words on walls, unbeknown to them, there's a lot of academic rigor that sits underneath it. So when they're hitting words that might link to creativity, innovation, etc., they go through an innovation adventure into the innovator space. When people talk about what gets them out of bed in the morning, and they might see being driven, intelligent, capable, agile, it's kind of taking you into kind of success and authority and champions and people who are loyal, traditional, safe, and structured. These guys are now leading into guardians. But what you can see straight away is if you're running that at a UK level or an organizational level, and just say for argument's sake, the goal that we needed a culture that was more to the right hand side, if we put a line through the middle, which means we wanted a culture that was sort of driving success and not and being quite traditional. If you had a employees or a UK workforce which are the complete opposite, so they sit opposite guardians because they're driven by innovation and adventure, it will make it very difficult to get them to lean in that sort of direction. Equally, when you look at champions versus citizens, it is the same opposites. So all of that has helped us start to think about a whole host of metrics that we've been able to measure the culture of the UK, which I'm going to hand over to Martin to get into the detail of. So you can see how this 6 minute exercise, just asking those three questions by hitting words on walls, provides a phenomenal amount of insight on what we know about the UK workforce. And with that, I hand over to Martin to go through the detail of that.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction right at the beginning. Okay, so most of the data that I'm going to be showing is from that second question that Adrian described. We're mostly going to be looking at what is the workplace experience of people within the UK across this study. As Adrian mentioned, over 6,000 completions that we've had. It's important to add that none of this is client data. This is all individual responses that we've got. We've covered the entirety of the UK. We've looked at the data across 30 different industries. We've also cross-sectioned that across different departments. We've got data on company size, seniority, and lots more. So all the things that you'd usually expect. So it is a nice, rich data set. And a lot of these comparisons, some of these comparisons we'll bring forward and show you here today, which I think will be good stimulus for the discussion I'm hoping that we'll be having once you've got your head around some of the data points. Okay, so the first thing that we look at is belonging. And this is the way that we measure this is that we look at the distance between the personal values and the workplace values. So as a reminder, the personal values is the first question that we ask, what's important to you? What gets you out of bed in the morning? And then we compare that data set to what people experience within the workplace. And essentially, we have an algorithm that calculates the distance between those 2 points. Yeah, so it's a little bit different than asking, how's your belonging, etc. The optimum for that is 100, right? So we want 100% belonging, of course, which makes sense. The UK average is actually 67%. What the data set shows us, though, when we put this across across the segment of age, is that belonging decreases with age. What's fair to say actually is that the data set for 67 plus is actually quite small, but all the other groups are by and large quite similar. And so we just find it quite interesting that it goes from the high 60s to more the mid 60s for the 55 to 66 year olds. And it's something that, if we saw that within a normal data set, we would be quite interested in that. The next aspect, though, with belonging is it may or may not be a surprise. And essentially what it shows us is that males have the highest levels of belonging. And it's quite important, again, to note that the data set for gender fluid, intersex, non-binary, um, they are quite small. But if we were to take all of them together and put them together with prefer not to say and prefer to self-define, that is quite a sizable data set. And across male and female, it is about 50-50 in terms of response rate. So that's the big one that we're looking at is, why is there a disparity between male and female when it comes to belonging across a data set of the UK, which is what this is showing us. The next aspect that we see is that CEOs have the highest levels of belonging. So just here on the right-hand side, I hope you can see my cursor. We're at 79 points, and it drops down to 63 points for entry level. So, of course, if you cross-reference those two pieces of data, then male CEOs have the highest level of belonging across the UK. Again, may not necessarily be a surprise to many of us, but at least now we have the data to be able to have these kinds of conversations. The next piece that we look at is creativity and innovation. And Adrian already showed you within that wheel, the circular wheel, how creativity sits opposite guardians, which we just saw a moment ago. Essentially, the way that we look at creativity and innovation is that we're looking for evidence of two specific things. We're looking for evidence of openness to change, and then we're looking for evidence of creativity, because those together are what we believe is what makes a truly creative and innovative environment. 26% of the UK say that they see evidence of creativity and innovation within the workplace. I've just got a slide here on the desired values. So a little bit of a change in the question. This is the final question, what do you desire? But I thought it would be interesting for you to have a look at. And essentially, what I think is going to be interesting for you to see is that the exec board, 45% of the exec, sorry, 42% of the exec board want to see creativity and innovation within the workplace. And that drops down to less than 25% for entry-level juniors. And so the question for leaders across the UK is, why is there such a disparity in terms of desires? Of course, we've got some ideas around that, but it'd be interesting potentially to hear what your ideas might be with that mismatch between desires of creativity and innovation. If we share the belief that creativity and innovation is one of the most important things to keep an organization moving, and I say one of, there are others, of course. The next aspect that we measure is cultural health. So we have a rating that measures the amount of toxicity that there might be within a culture. The way that we do that is that within the workplace culture question, within the question where we ask you, what is it you see within the workplace, there are some limiting words, and we describe them as potentially limiting. There's certainly conversation pieces. And that makes up about 20% of that data set. And that 20% therein is our baseline. So the optimum here is that essentially we don't see any of those potentially limiting factors within the culture. If you're below 20%, you get into this green rating. So the UK overall, essentially from what we can see, is that the health of most cultures is generally positive, right? Generally positive. There are some outliers, which of course I'll share. These are the top 5 issues in the UK workplace. And straight away, you can probably see why we describe these as potentially limiting, because through a lot of discussion, demanding could be seen as a very positive. Cost reducing has sometimes been described as a positive as well. And it's probably worth me just spending a couple of seconds just describing why we put those there. Everything that we see here, or all of those 18 sentiments, we believe that if you had a culture where that was sustained, so if you have a culture where it's demanding but it's sustained over a long period of time, then that is potentially a watch point. That could be a drain on the culture, and it's something for leaders to look out for. In the same way, as all of you know, that a culture that's gone through sustained cost reducing for a long period of time, that's going to eat into the goodwill, well-being, etc. So that's why these are watch points. I think obviously things like silos, hierarchy and confuse. Probably a bit more cut and dry, right? We can probably agree that they are definitely detrimental to the culture. But essentially, you can see what the top 5 issues are for the UK. In terms of the sectors that have really good cultural health, these are the top 3. So arts and craft, only 8% of the words that were selected were limiting, 12%, 13% computer software, management consulting. And then these ones are the ones where it's a bit more challenging. So 26% of the words, so well over a quarter of the words that were selected, bearing in mind you can only select 10 words within this question. Over 25% of the words for government are limiting, 24% of FMCG and 23% for private equity. So you can really see a difference between the challenges for certain industries. What we also see here is that cultural health gets worse with size of company. And it's worth pointing out that the data set is relatively even across size of company. So we have good representation from 1 to 10, right the way through to 10,000 person plus organizations. And we can see that essentially, we've got less than 10% for 1 to 10 organizations. So less than 10% of the words selected were limiting, the words like hierarchy, cross-reducing, etc. And it goes to around 23, 24% for the 10,000 plus size organization. So a real gap there, a real distance between the experience between those two sizes. The next aspect that we have is a measure on burnout. And this is essentially where we look at the combination of demanding and long hours, right? So we are looking for people who have selected both of these terms within the questionnaire. Bear in mind, you have 100 words, as a reminder, you have 100 words which you can select, 99 to be exact. And so we're looking for people who've selected those 2 words together. The UK average is 6.7. Let's round it up to 7% to make it a bit easier. And then we can see that lowest levels of burnout are across these industries. So computer software, defense, design, arts and crafts, electrical, all have low levels of burnout. And the industries with the higher levels of burnout, again, may not be a surprise to see hospital and healthcare right there at the top with 17%. That probably confirms, sort of some of the stuff that we may hear in the news. FMCG, sustainability, legal services, education. Again, legal services may not necessarily be a surprise. And of course, with things like burnout, when we're looking at demanding long hours, some of these things are part of the culture or have become part of the culture, right? So there may be an argument to say, well, actually, if you go into a specific industry like the legal services, well, that is just how things are done. But again, from where we sit, it's certainly a watch point, specifically if you have a department where it's 10% level of burnout and another department where it's 30%, level of burnout, that could certainly be an issue. And once again, what the data is showing us is that burnout increases with size of company. So it's not a huge data set. I mean, it is quite squeezed, right? So we're going from 4% just over to 10%. So it is quite squeezed. But within that data set, which is quite confined, it is, it's still over a 6-point margin, 6-point difference. The next aspect that I want to show you, and this is our final metric, is around psychological safety. And I just want to set the scene a little bit around psychological safety before I get into some of the metrics. So our friends at Accenture, they say that 76% people are more engaged if psychological safety is evident. You get 50% more productivity and 74% less stress. And equally, people at PwC say that there may be an issue here with psychological safety, though. What they're citing here is that CEOs, 54% of CEOs say that, dissent and debate is encouraged, right? So if it is encouraged, there must be a space to do that. But equally, they're saying that only 27% of workers see evidence of it. So we've got a report from Accenture saying it's really, really important, and then PwC is saying, okay, it's important, but it's not necessarily as good as CEOs are seeing it. So let's see how our data sort of fits into that mix. And of course, you would have read about psychological safety yourselves from other areas. So the first thing to point out is the way that we measure psychological safety, which is essentially across these four key components. We're looking for evidence of open communication, healthy challenge, trust, and conflict resolution. And we've broken that down a bit more, but I'll keep it at this sort of top level, these big four concepts. And what the data is showing us is that 43% of the data set, 43% of the UK see evidence of open communication, healthy challenge, trust, and conflict resolution. The optimum is 100%, right? We want everybody to see evidence of all four of those, ideally. And what I've got here is a little breakdown for you that shows how it scores across each of those four parameters. So I've just highlighted in green for you the two areas where, the UK, we have scored the highest. So 52% people see evidence of open communication, 52% people see evidence of trust. And they're both within the community category if you go back to that wheel. But it's probably not important at this point. Let's keep it at this level. 42% see evidence of the traditional level of healthy challenge. That's about being polite and respectful. And I think that probably resonates, right? I think, most it's very UK thing to be polite and respectful in the workplace, I think. The next one below that is conflict resolution, which is linked to selflessness. Now, that's about how you present yourself within the realm of psychological safety. Are you presenting yourself in terms to get to a higher understanding of meaning, to collaborate, or are you presenting yourself to win the argument? So that's essentially what that conflict resolution piece is measuring. And then the lowest aspect for us in the UK is around the adventure axes of healthy challenge. That's about having the courage to speak out. It's about the speak up culture, and that is at 34%. So again, you may have certain questions about this particular aspect, but certainly it's very interesting data. Again, once again, we have the sector information. So these sectors have the highest levels of psychological safety. Management consulting, they're 52%. Design, insurance, HR, medical practice. And it kind of makes sense, right? Management consulting is about having difficult conversations, right? I mean, you wouldn't be able to survive within the consulting space. So that makes sense. It's kind of embedded into workflows. However, the areas with the lower levels of psychological safety are here. And again, it is worth noting, if we go from the highest at 52 to the lowest of 38, again, it's not a huge margin of difference. So we are playing with a very, very squeezed sort of middle section of where organizations operate within, specifically for this psychological safety piece, which I think is interesting in and of itself. What we also see, though, once again, is that larger organizations find it harder to have the space. So remember, the axis is flipped this time. So what we're seeing here is that over 46% of people within smaller organizations see evidence of psychological safety, and about 40, nearly 41% of the 10,000 plus organizations, people within those size organizations see evidence of psychological safety. So it decreases with size of company as well, which is a trend that we're seeing across all of the data sets, right? One of the final slides that I'd like to leave you then is really just to show that how we've measured performance and psychological safety. And of course, we can measure performance and all of the other metrics, but I'll leave you with this one before we get into the discussion. And essentially, what we asked our respondents to do is to self-certify as to whether they were a below average, average, or above average performing organization. And then we're able to cross-reference that with things like psychological safety. And what it shows us is that for people who said that their organization is above average, they have higher levels of psychological safety than those who say that the performance of their organization is below average. Yeah. So I thought I would leave you with that as another stimulus point. And with that, I will hand back over to Richard to take us through any questions and thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Adrian. There's some really quite striking things there actually. Which before I open up to the group specifically, so anything that struck you in the group, anything that you'd like to ask, I'm just going to ask one question each of Martin and Adrian, which, as I say, they've sent me in advance, which I rather like. In fact, I might actually get you guys to write my questions all together from now on because they're
Be a
good.
pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Cheers, appreciate it. So, Martin, let's start with you because this is the creativity and an innovation point. You was talking about in the slides, for instance, that what struck me was only 42% of exec board responders want to see creativity and innovation, if I've got that right. What the hell are the other 58% doing was what sort of struck me. It seemed oddly low, and that was the higher figure. But moving on to the what you were saying is that with the UK's creativity and innovation average at just 26%, which is very low, it seems to me, how can leaders create environments that encourage out-of-the-box thinking and support employees in embracing change, which I think is a really nice question. So how do they do that? It's all about the psychological safety, I assume, as it's a big part of it. But how do they go about creating environments in your view?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is essentially about psychological safety. I think the other aspect is for us to remember the profile of the UK. So I'm going to paint a very horrible broad brushstroke, right? But it is to just illustrate the point. But essentially, what the data is showing us is that in the UK, we are community driven. So that's about collaboration, being friendly. We're traditional. That's about being respectful and polite, and we're also safety conscious, right? So we like to be reliable. We like to do a good job, right? And that is by and large the profile of the UK business. And then what we see is creativity and innovation is low for our personal values, right? Because tradition and safety is very high, and it's also low within the businesses. So in a strange way, we've created businesses that mirror us, right? It's probably not that strange actually when I said it. It's probably, probably makes a lot of sense, right? You create something in your mirror image. And so because of that, it's just to be mindful that if you wish to take people on a journey, that whilst we understand that creativity and innovation, not as many of us maybe understand it as much as we should, whilst we may understand the importance of it, how it's done is going to be quite critical. But more importantly, have we created enough of the structures and given people the safety in which they can make mistakes, which is then the gateway to creativity and innovation?
Do you think it's also the terms don't necessarily help in the sense that they sound a bit over-egged? I mean, exactly. I'm
Yeah,
going to do creativity and innovation now. People are creative all the time at work, every day, but they might not call it that.
I think that's a very good point. So I ran a design agency for 15 years, and you're paid to be creative, but then actually, you know, most of the time you're paid to solve very discrete problems, rather than create this brand new thing all of the time, right? So we can't exist in a state of the new all of the time, but we can exist in a space of critical thinking. I think maybe critical thinking stuff like that is probably better. However, we do know that when we're describing it, we're talking about people having autonomy to be able to think on their own, certainly make some mistakes, and it's probably a horrible word, we call it sort of a sandbox, but some sort of a space where their new ideas can flourish is essentially what we're talking about.
Yeah, so it's doing it consciously. I see exactly what you mean,
Yeah,
providing, as you say, the sort of structures for that. Thanks, Martin.
yeah.
Probably to put down the slides, because I will see our members then, if that's all right. Thank you very much. And then, Adrian, to ask your question, which is, again, a huge issue. Traditional productivity metrics often fail to capture the nuances of cultural health and employee engagement. How should organisations rethink productivity to better align with the cultural values they want to instill?
Yeah, so thank you, Richard. Yeah, I mean that is the big question. I think what we see far too many times is boards and excos are very much focused on outcomes and outputs, right? So when it comes to productivity, they're looking at employee metrics, they're looking at customer satisfaction, they're looking at compliance, and all sorts of other productivity and efficiency metrics, right? And they're looking at how those move forward and then seeing the impact on financial returns, right? Against either numbers or outcomes that businesses are trying to achieve. But actually, what we increasingly see, particularly with our clients, is that actually culture can be the deal maker and deal breaker in all of those metrics that lead up to productivity and return. So what do I mean by saying that? If you treat, if you don't focus on the outputs, but focus on the input, which is culture, and as Martin alluded to in the report, you can fiddle around with moving psychological safety or reducing cultural health or improving belonging or reducing burnout. All of these things in the culture, i.e., the inputs, start to have a better impact on those traditional productivity measures. So if you take something, there's always this debate around what's the difference between culture and engagement, and do engagement surveys tell the story of culture, or are they the same or different? Well, for me, you can have a really engaged audience in a culture that's not going to help you win. But if you shift the culture as an input, that will directly impact the engagement scores, the same compliance, the same productivity, the same burnout. And therefore, you start to see how those things all link up to return on investment. So for me, it's about the forward thinking people in HR to have really good, powerful data to change the narrative around how organizations see productivity, and to switch from, whilst recognize the importance of measuring outputs, just be very conscious of the importance of measuring and managing the inputs.
Got it. Nice answer. Makes sense. Thanks, Adrian. So network members, love to hear from you now. What has most struck you? Questions for the chaps, questions for the group. Things that you would take away, things that you would challenge.
I've got a quick question, Richard, and I think I might be focusing slightly on the wrong thing here, but I can't help that this question's come up for me. Love the presentation. If we see and we understand that we've kind of created organizations that's about being traditional and safety, because that's, that mirror effect that you mentioned, Martin. Does your data in any way, shape, or form also indicate where we inadvertently incentivize, consciously or unconsciously, against innovation in the workspaces outside of the categories of tradition and safety?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, it is a really, really good question. We see that in some of the limiting factors. So stuff that will kill innovation will be hierarchy, bureaucracy, obviously silos. That there are certain watch points that we have that we've configured, and it always surprises me, and it's because it's a circular system. So if you have, for example, you say, right, we want to be really, really innovative, etc., blah, 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 we want to do these really good things. And then you sort of say, right, but really what we want to do is we want to measure all of the outputs from it. What do you know what I mean? That's the kind of thing that straight away sort of happens. So we can see that from a policy point of view. But on our wheel, what we're seeing is you're asking to be creative up here. Then at the bottom, you're putting in lots of red tape. So they cancel each other out, if that makes sense. Yeah.
What's your view, Annika? Do you think we organisations often mitigate against it unwittingly or not?
I do actually. So I'm just thinking in a previous life about an organization who really wanted to focus hard on the culture of innovation and collaboration, particularly. But they inadvertently still managed in the narrative to the organization on the cultural how, still made the money the big thing. So our money makers remained the ones in power. Inadvertently, you then squash any ideas that anyone else wanted to bring, really, because if the moneymakers aren't going to think it's a good idea, well, then why would I bother? And so it took quite a few iterations of being able to tell the CEO, your heart's in the right place, but the stories you tell are still about money, 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 not purpose, belonging, cultural, how, value. And you're not actually, I mean, we had what I would call token prizes for culturally doing the how correctly. But the main highlights, whether it's promotions or big prizes or whatever, still went to the money makers. So I think there's this, unless you incentivize with the same intensity and focus on that cultural how, at least my take at the time was, then you're never going to get the same balance between the two.
Yeah, good story. Yeah, that makes
So,
sense.
so there's sorry, just to jump in, 'cause you've done a deep dive into values theory, which probably just want to highlight quickly. So there's two people there's two schools of thoughts, right? So you can either incentivize extrinsic values with extrinsic sort of stuff, or intrinsic values with intrinsic sort of areas. And what you've described there is that extrinsic reward, as in financial, cross section with intrinsic values, more sort of creativity. Yeah, it certainly doesn't work. There's two schools of thoughts out there. I'm more on the side that you're talking about, which is, if you want to drive creativity and innovation, you need to give intrinsic rewards for that.
Presumably, as Annika was suggesting, Annika was giving a specific example, obviously, but it's like sectorally, it can often be the case, can it not, that some sectors are more used to extrinsic rewards, Martin, and therefore it's quite a cultural norm to break, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. Sexually, culturally, I mean, it's from school, isn't it? That, I think in the UK, sorry, in the US, there was a study where they were paying children to read school books. And then what they quickly found was that, they were reading shorter books, and books below their reading age. So that's just, it doesn't work, but it's something that people try all the time, which is quite interesting.
It's an interesting study. Talk about driving the wrong behavior. Okay, so other thoughts on that specifically, or more generally on what we've been talking about today, cultural health. How does it work in your organisation? Also wondered actually how you found creating an atmosphere of psychological safety, or rather an environment of one. How easy or not have you found that to do?
Richard, as usual, I can't find the hand up button. Sorry, it just interjected. I'm cheating here because Martin, Adrian, you know me, we're working together. So, yeah, I'm actually in the middle of working on the culture survey insight, which we've run. So, if anyone does want to chat about it, we're going through it right now. But I thought it was really interesting, Martin, hearing you talk again about the kind of UK data, because as you were just talking to that kind of the sectors, there's things in there that definitely resonate when you see that data, isn't there? You look at it and go, oh yeah, some of those sectors that have higher burnout or yeah, lower psychological safety. Something that came to my mind, and I think there's probably others within your network, Richard, that this relates to, is those of us that work in organisations that are perhaps more safe and traditional in their setup. I work for Which, so we're a charity and we've got a lot of governance around us. So naturally, our default is to be more structured and safe in how we approach things. And we are looking to do exactly what you were just talking to, which is up the innovation and creativity, and sort of create more of that culture at Which. So I was just interested from what you were saying, given that seems to be a UK trend, is this something you see a lot of companies kind of battling with, of their sort of DNA makeup and their preferences as a default being quite the opposite of what you might want to be dialing up, so to speak, on the innovation side?
Do you want to answer that one, Adrian, about legal firms and maybe some of the stuff that you've done there?
The question was too highbrow for me, very highbrow. But I will try. And maybe because you're leading me in the legal space, it's a conversation around some of the things that we find, right? So we do a lot of work in the legal industry, and sometimes we can find when we run the culture decoder. Um, we see environments where, just to keep it sort of simple, the reasons, and Martin, nod if I'm going in the right direction. What people get out of bed for, i.e., in law firms, what drives
Mm,
them, they actually experience this in the workplace, right? So
mm,
then what you've naturally got is people think, well, what drives me and what I say, I've got a natural sense of belonging. So at the moment, it sounds really good. And then we
mm,
ask them, so what do they want? And they all want similar things.
mm,
So on the face of it, it tells a really good culture story. The challenge is in the legal industry, a lot of them understand, because, and they're not the only industry, but because of AI, etc., it's going to rapidly change that industry.
mm,
So really, you've got an industry that's all walking together, but they're kind of walking off a cliff because you need innovation and creativity to survive, but at the heart of some of the culture from the top, middle, and bottom, it sits at the opposite and our will. So they're more
Yeah.
structured, safe, and traditional. So the work that we've been doing is almost to try and move to fixed to open growth mindsets. Because if you can unlock the sort of growth mindsets at the top or in the middle, because of the disproportionate impact they have on galvanizing the people that work for them in the various communities around the business, it's a gateway to trying to drive change. But for them, it can be really tough, and so sometimes it's about telling them the story. Sometimes we end up having to reset values for them, behaviors, coaching, group coaching, just to try and get them to kind of think differently. Because it's just fascinating because our data tells a lovely story, but I think it's a dangerous story with the amount of change affecting that industry. Martin, you didn't nod. So I'm just
Didn't
taking it.
need to. Didn't need to.
Okay.
I would have broken my neck with the amount of nodding.
I'll tell you one thing. I know, Richard, you're asking the questions, but I'm interested in any observations around what we've presented from this lovely cohort, even if it's not a question.
I think but again, this might be just the way I listen to it, but the opposite parts of your wheel, you are not necessarily saying that they are entirely mutually exclusive, right?
That's correct. That is correct. Yeah. So we're saying that wheel, all of us inhabit all of those four quadrants on all of those sections. But essentially, I will act in a certain way within the work environment. I mean, and it's the point again is that we're talking about the work environment, right? I may present as innovator in the workplace and guardian at home, right? We're not static entities, right? We're moving. We're very complex, right? Which of course you guys know because you're in this space. So we're just trying to capture that workplace environment. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it might,
but I guess go on.
no, sorry, I was just going to add, so it might almost be possible to get your workplace to think about when to spend time and which energy.
So it's a very good point. And so we use the same system when we talk about leadership styles, right? So when you bring it in, at an individual level, what is your leadership style? How do you present most of the time? And each leadership style has a benefit,
Yeah.
and each leadership style has a deficiency. Do you know what I
Okay.
mean? And it's just sort of understanding that. But it's a very good question. Thank you.
Our network members found that the CEO and leadership teams are engaged with cultural health and the culture generally. Is it something you see? Is it quite an easy sell, would you say, or is it? What sort of objections do you find? Are they more focused on other things than you would like? Typically, have you found? What's your experiences?
I'll come in and share it, if I can, please. I found it fascinating. Thank you. As someone who's worked in PE for the last 10 years and struggled to have these types of conversations with any detailed element to describing those inputs in order to achieve the outputs and outcomes which are prominent in PE. You invited observations as well, Richard. One of the things that I was fascinated about is the correlation between creativity, innovation, and performance curves and leadership, because there's a theory that says when performance is struggling, that is the perfect time to invite more creativity and innovation. And in fact, my experience is when the performance curve is under more pressure, the invitation, in fact, becomes more closed because people tend to kind of hanker down on what they know and keep doing that and just push harder and more rather than different and varied. So yeah, I found it really fascinating. I wondered whether you had any comments on that kind of performance curve piece.
I like it. It's you know what we're going to run that tomorrow. I want to see what that says in
Mm,
terms of it. But you're absolutely right. And just sort of going back to um, most consultancy work that you do is that there's a bit before things fall over that is optimum, isn't it? For
mm,
stuff to be done. And of course, when things completely fall over, which is your point, you've just missed that point because you're really you're firefighting instead of just putting out, couple of blazes. So that makes a lot of sense, and it's certainly, I think that's any consultant's response, right? We see that all the time. So yeah, absolutely right.
thank you.
Heck of a
It's
judgment call.
interesting.
Oh, sorry, Adrian, after you.
No, it looks like there's another question there.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's.
Yeah. I was just going to say, sorry, Penny. I was just going to say quickly. It must be a hell of a judgment call to judge. Are we about to break, or are we currently? It's a.
Yeah, but I'll just say one thing. Sorry, I just want to jump in there. I kind of feel like so we work with different people in different ways, but some of the people are using us for that very reason.
Okay.
Because if you think about culture, if we can see your psychological health is getting lower, your
Hmm.
cultural health is under pressure, your burnout, you're starting to see some of the indicators, and this is the conversations we have in financial services. So they're under pressure from the regulator around risk culture and the implications of that. And they're looking to financial services organizations to say, what data can we have preventative? So, how do we get to the CBI before the CBI? How do we get to, and a lot of that we can see in the stories that our data is presenting. So I think that is a part of the story. I guess the other bit, because you mentioned you're in the sort of PE space, which is quite exciting for us, is we've started to talk to a lot of people about using us as cultural due diligence. So in PE, when you're doing the purchase, everyone's quick to do the legal and the financial due diligence, but actually doing, even if it's a light touch culture DD, not just about taking the partners out for dinner, but understanding that stuff um, can help you then think about what the plan is for the company refurb, if you want to put it in that sort of language. So knowing that culture, who do we put in there? You talked earlier on about the curve. How do you shift the J curve so that actually you can start to extract the value out of the deal quicker? Because those that don't understand that, that's a lot of time when we come in. Most of the work we end up doing, the story is always, well, we've grown through M&A over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years, and all the integrations have now started to unravel, and we're being asked to try and reset using the tool because it feels like it's what's the word? It feels it's a cathartic exercise to encourage and invite people to contribute to the future of a business.
Got you.
What we find.
Yeah, and good point about the indicators as well, actually, because obviously you do have those in organisations. So yeah, that's a great answer. Rachel, we'll come to you in just a sec. Penny, sorry to keep you waiting.
No worries. It was just an observation, really. I think you asked about what we're seeing in our own organisation. So I'm in housing, heavily regulated. We've had some frisky feedback from the regulator over the last year. And what I've seen is our psychological safety has gone down considerably. And I think that's due to fear. And what I'm trying to talk to the exec about is recognising that the shadow they cast across the organisation impacts on that. But because they're under so much stress and pressure, I think sometimes I've had to just take a step back and remind myself that they're people too, because I can see it. They're exuding this stress and they're getting frustrated with people. Why don't people answer? Why aren't people engaged? Why aren't they answering our questions? And it's because if you ask them that question in that way, they're going to retreat. And that's what I'm seeing is this huge retreat of psychological safety. And no one wanting to put their head above the parapet and say, I'm not sure this is the right thing, or I don't agree, because they can see the impact it has. I know what's driving it. What's driving it is pressure and fear and pressure from the regulator. And it's an interesting one to try and get that balance between someone who is showing signs of extreme stress and getting them to see that when they're in a leadership position, it's not just their own mood they're affecting, it's the shadow they're casting across the organisation. I'm not sure I've cracked the nut yet. And equally, I have to be very careful about how I say it, because, you know, you say, oh, this might not be a great thing to do, and you get your head taken off and you're like, okay, that probably wasn't successful. But it's just quite interesting where I'm seeing it more and more. Organizations who are under extreme stress and pressure, it's all bets are off, and they're focused on keeping afloat and all of this stuff. While I'm trying to say to them, but keeping us afloat is about keeping people motivated and engaged and still being attractive. But it's almost like, I think Annika said earlier, it's all about the money. It's all about keeping afloat. It's all about keeping going. And it's almost like trying to raise the profile of the importance of people as well, if that makes sense. I mean, we're not looking at money because we're kind of charitable sector. We're just looking at keeping going, if you see what I mean. So it was just an observation, really, rather than a question, Richard. Thank you.
That's cool. It makes a lot of sense. Backs up what people were saying earlier as well. Thanks, Penny.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And Rachel.
Hello. It's been enlightening. I work in should we say I can never get the word out. Quasar government, in that we're not fully government, but we have to operate in how we work. And then I look at our age profile of our organisation, which, just being candid, is people who have maybe worked in industry and are now in their older years, should we say. And I work in the organisation, and I see the culture, and we have an issue. I'm just going to say, there's lots of white male men with a certain attitudes that we're getting lots of feedback on, particularly in areas like, should we say, sexual harassment and things like that. So not great, should we say. But I look at this, and then I look at the profile we are, and we've got a new people director in who's people and culture. So the hope is our culture will at some point transform into something that you don't have psychological safety issues, because we have that as well. So it's been really enlightening to see the data, because it's just reinforced to me, oh, that's maybe why we have some of the problems we have. So, but what my next question was, when you find yourselves in a place like that, you obviously need to take action to bring around change. On average, how long does it take a culture like I've got at the moment and the reality of it actually shifting to produce into the more positive space? Because I look at all the data and going, oh my gosh, how can me as a strategic people partner or as a people services manager actually bring that about? Because I see all the grievances coming in. So it's like you're just chasing your tail. So I think I'm after a little bit of hope in my question from the experts.
What a great question. Can we give Rachel
hope, please?
I mean, from my perspective, it's when I've seen our clients fly, is because it's had, 100% leadership buy-in across the board. And when I see that, and I'm to the point where sometimes I say the CEO is actually the HRD. Do you know what I mean? Like they are just on it and they're in sync. And then I think, you get more deviation away from that and things become harder. But that's my observation.
Yeah, I think leadership do play a big role, but I think the key point as well is, and that's why we're breaking it down, right? So these terms are bandied around like psychological safety, and you end up working on psychological safety without knowing perhaps the aspect around psychological safety that's most under threat is healthy challenge or conflict resolution. And that way you can be quite pointed in what you need to do to drive the change. And I think there's also a finite amount of time and resources. And that's where because we believe the areas we cover are the coordinates between success and greater success, whatever your objectives and goals are. When we're doing our stuff, we're just pulling out the three things. So we might find that it is A grade in an organization where we can see pointedly what the issues are. And therefore, if you focus on that, you've got a bigger chance of seeing a change, as opposed to trying to sheep dip entire organizations. Like, my favorite's always unconscious bias training. So post George Floyd, that was huge, that was massive. And then we just sheep dip the whole organization through unconscious bias training. And millions of pounds later, we're not seeing any shift. And I think that's because they've not understood what the trigger points are in across the many facets of culture to be able to have bigger and more significant change.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Can we have, just before we finish, one more? Anyone like to dip in with some words of hope for Rachel? We've got a lot of change experts on the call.
I think I'd probably just say I'm trying to undergo cultural change in our German business, and it does just take a long time. So just like you see things changing, but it doesn't always come out in like engagement scores and things like that. But I think that's just my personal experience. But I would say our performance has massively increased, but our engagement's lagging behind. So there are seeds of hope, and it just takes a while. It just is not a 6 month turnaround, but it's going in the right direction. So if that
Hang in there is what I'm hearing. Okay. Well,
Hang in there, keep going. And as Ali says, there might be more change happening than perhaps even the figures suggest anyway.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, got you. Thanks, Ali. Well, thanks everyone. Adrian and Martin, thank you ever so much. Really nice working with you. Really enjoyed it, and thank you for doing this. We'll see you all again soon. The 2025 programs are out next week, and there's one more Experts at Work next Wednesday at 11 o'clock. But thank you ever so much for coming. Thanks for your great questions. Adrian, Martin, thank you again. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers, guys.